this video, we're going to be discussing environment variables, why you need them, and how to use them in your JavaScript projects. Environment variables are, simply put, variables that are available in the environment your program will run in. These variables are different from typical ones because they can be set outside of your source code, but still used inside of it. The fact that environment variables do not need to be declared in your source code makes them useful for dealing with sensitive information or values that should be different depending on what environment your code is running in, so a dev server versus a prod server, for example. So consider this example where we're trying to connect to a database without using environment variables. There are a few issues with this code. The first issue is one of security, since we have sensitive database credentials stored in our source code. So if our source code gets leaked, or if it's stored in a public Git repository, anyone would be able to access our database. The second issue here is that we might want to connect to one database for development, another for testing, and a third during production. If our database credentials are hard-coded in our source code, we'd have to make code changes for each environment. A better and more secure way to connect to our database here is in this example. In this example, no sensitive information is saved in our source code, and we'll also be able to set different values for these variables depending on which environment we're in. So we can have our dev, test, and prod environments point to different databases without having to modify any of our code. There are a few ways you can use environment variables in JavaScript projects, but my preferred method is using the .env package along with a .env environment variable file. So hopping into VS Code, the first thing we can do for this example is initialize a package.json with npm init and then -y to accept the default values. We're also going to install the .env package with npm i.env. And then I'm also going to initialize a Git repo in this directory. So as mentioned before, our environment variables are going to be stored in a file called .env. And we can just paste them in there like that. So we're going to have the name of the variable and then the value. If your variable is going to have any spaces in it, you're going to want to wrap it in quotations. But if there's no spaces in your variable, quotations aren't necessary. So hard coding these values in a .env file might seem like it contradicts our previous security concerns. But the reason this works is because we're going to use a .gitignore, which we can use to exclude our env file from source control. So even though this is going to be hard-coded and saved on our local machine, you can see that because it's in our gitignore, it's grayed out and it won't be committed to Git, and it won't end up in our Git repository. So if we push to Git and we have a public repo, this .env file will not be included, which makes this more secure. So we're going to handle this .env file with some extra care. Also, while I'm here, I'm going to include node modules in our gitignore, which is also good practice because you don't need to be including the node modules directory inside your Git repo. Now that we have our .env file created, we can hop over to index.js and start writing some code. In Node.js, our environment variables are available to us on process.env and then the variable name. So we can try logging out these three environment variables that we've set. So initially, if we just run node index.js, we're going to get 3 undefined because we haven't actually used the .env package yet. So invoking the .env package is as easy as just saying require .env and then calling the config method on it. So if we try this again, we can see our 3 variables printed out successfully. Another way to invoke .env, and the method I prefer, is to actually call it inside of a script. So we can make a dev script here, and we would say node-r.env/config, and then call index.js. And now if we run this script through npm run dev, we still get our environment variables, and this way we didn't have to have another line of code in index.js to invoke that. The last thing I'm going to review is how we can set environment variables on a service like Heroku. Heroku is a very popular service for hosting Node.js projects, and because we're not including that .env file with our source code, when we deploy to Heroku, those variables won't be available by default. To set environment variables on Heroku, you'd go to your project, settings, and click reveal config vars. Once you're here, you'd be able to set your values just like this. So we could set a DB password and a value of test123 and add it there. Once all these environment variables are set here, when your code executes on this server, these are the values that we'll use. So this is how you can set database credentials to access your production database when it runs on Heroku, but you could also have different values when you run locally so that you access a test database instead. If you have any other questions about how to use environment variables, or any questions about web development in general, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you found this video helpful, a like and subscribe are always appreciated. Thanks for watching, and happy coding.